Hi you guys. Have you ever worked on a project that was just so hard for you to get through that you just kind of didn't find joy working on? If so, then maybe you can relate to me with this quilt. It was probably one of the hardest quilts I've ever made. And not because the pattern wasn't written well or anything like that. It's just because the pattern did not suit me and my skill level and the way I'm used to quilting. So if you want to hear more about it and find out what this pattern is, just keep on watching. So this pattern is the mini double 9 patch, and it's from the Missouri Star Quilt Company. I saw the tutorial for this video on the Missouri Star Quilt Company's YouTube channel, and I just fell in love with the way it looked. And immediately I wanted to do it a little bit different, into a black or a dark background, and then do really bright, colorful print where they had the dark. And I just had this vision for how it would turn out, and I just really could not wait to get started on it. So I bought all the fabric, I bought the pattern, and oh my goodness, this pattern, the way that you build the pieces together is supposed to make it quicker because they're obviously really tiny pieces, but I really struggled on making it work. And I show a little bit of, I'll show a few clips of what exactly I mean. And it definitely doesn't mean that this isn't a pattern that you should try to do if you're interested in it or anything like that. I'm just going to kind of explain why it was hard for me, so that if you have a similar quilting style or anything like that, then you'll just kind of know that maybe this pattern won't work for you either, and you could find something similar that is pieced together in a way that works best for your style. Okay, so I'm going to share a few of the clips of what I struggled with on putting this quilt together. So to make this mini double 9 patch quilt, the first thing we need to do is get our blocks. And our blocks are essentially going to look like this, where we have our 9 patches on the ends and in the middle, and then solid blocks between those. So we have a mini 9 patch, and then we're going to make a bigger 9 patch essentially. So that's the block we're going to be making. And to get there, we need to make 2 different strips. So my background on my quilt is solid black. So in the quilt example, the solid is white, but I'm reversing my colors. My colors are going to be bright on the 9 patch, and then the background is black instead of white. So essentially we're going to be making 2 different strips. Our middle strip, which is going to be the middle of our 9 patch, where the outsides of the block are dark, and then the outer part of the 9 patch where the outside is our patterned piece. So we're making 2 different strips. Our pattern in the middle, and then the background on the outside, and then our background in the middle, and our pattern on the outside. So we need to get these strips made, and then we cut the strips down into our little pieces that we piece together to our mini 9 patch. So to get these strips, what we're going to do is sew 2 strips together. So we line our strips up, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam around the end. Okay, and let me see, I threw one over here. So I'm going to sew 2 of these just for now, just to show you. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along both of these. struggles that I have when I sew these longer strips like that is I have a hard time keeping the fabric from kind of flowing to the side. So getting that accurate seam is kind of difficult for me on these longer strips. So what we do with these is we're going to cut them in half. So we're going to cut them at 1 1/4 inches. So as you can see, my sewing line doesn't line up quite right with the 1 inch mark, which would get me the 1 1/4. So already when I got to this step, I knew that the piecing was going to be pretty hard. Now, if you watch Jenny Dolan's tutorial on this with the from the Missouri Star Quilt Company, and I'll link it in the comments or in the description. She, I think, folds them in half and cuts them so she doesn't have to cut along such a long line, which is gonna get you some of those waves. I don't feel comfortable doing it that way because when I do fold mine in half and cut, I often get a weird like scalloped end kind of at the seam, and it just never works out well for me. So honestly, either way, I end up with not very accurate strips here. So it's just kind of a step that's hard, and that's why this pattern just doesn't work for me. So as you see here, we end up with a background and a patterned piece. And we're going to cut the other one as well. And so here we have, and I'm going to press those, and then we'll have the same on this one. And again, it does not line up perfectly. I'm going to try to keep firm and keep it as best as I can. But then, so here we have another one that has a pattern and a background. And so I'll press them, and we add on, depending on which block we need, some of these leftover strips. So if I need a pattern, a background, and a pattern, I would sew the pattern onto this side. And then if I need a background, pattern, background, I would take that other strip and sew it onto this side. And so that's how we get those different strips that we need. So we have a background, pattern background, and a pattern background pattern. And so these would be on the outer side of our mini 9 patch, and this one would be a middle strip on the mini 9 patch. So I'm going to set these aside and let me show you. So we have 2 that are already sewed together. And like I said, those we cut down to get our strips like these. So to cut these, you would square up an edge. Let me try to line this up somewhere nice. So we would square up an edge. And then again, we cut these into 1 1/4. And get those. Now, sometimes, even though I press the dickens out of these seams, sometimes when I cut here, and I'm going to kind of exaggerate it, but sometimes when I hit that seam, my rotary cutter kind of wants to flare over to the side. So that is one of the other struggles I get on these, is I just am not that great at cutting through seams like that. So you would cut all of your strips like this. You would cut your cut all of your strips to 1 1/4 inches, and the The pattern is really good at telling you how many how many strips you need to make of each type, and how many squares you need to cut and everything like that. So that's where we get our little mini 9 patch. So we would sew all those together so that they look like this. And you can see, you know, I have to do a lot of squaring to get these to look right. It's just, it seems like when you watch it done in the tutorial that it's going to come together really quickly, but you still honestly have a lot of cutting to do. Yeah, you don't have to cut little tiny squares and piece them all together. With the strip method, it comes together a little quicker. But if you're like me, where you struggle with sewing accurate 1/4 inch seams over long periods and have trouble cutting through seams and just keeping all of these tiny pieces to size, it might be a hard pattern for you to do like it is for me. So I just wanted to show those little you know, clips of what I felt was hard in this pattern, just so you know, and don't purchase all of the fabric to make this quilt if it might not be a good pattern for you working with the tiny pieces like it is for me. Hopefully this was helpful, because I know there's a lot of beginners out there, and when you see a pattern like this done in a tutorial and it looks so easy, it can be really discouraging to purchase it and struggle through it like I have been. And I've been sewing for a long time, but this strip piecing, these tiny strips, just is really a struggle for me in keeping everything nice and accurate 1/4 inch seams. I think it's still going to be a really beautiful quilt, and for me, points and lining stuff up isn't as important as it is to some people. So I think I'm still going to really like this quilt when it's finished. But I did want you to see some of the parts that were harder for me, just so you can decide if it is a pattern for you. Okay, so with all of that said and all the struggles I had, I actually still think it is a really beautiful quilt. I'm glad that I kept working on it. I'm glad that I finished it, even though this quilt took a lot longer than I'm used to put together. And only the top is done. I haven't quilted it yet. I've been needing to work on it in little pieces and little bits along the way, because I just, it was really hard for me to work on it. And I kept seeing all the flaws that I was creating, and it just made it a struggle for me to really want to sit down and work on it. But after it's all put together, I really like how it looks. So you can see a lot of the parts where this, the seams don't quite meet, and that doesn't necessarily always bother me in a quilt. It's not something I care about a whole lot, but with the way I designed it, with the back being really dark and the pattern colors being very bright, it stands out a lot more on this quilt than it normally does on some of my other quilts. You don't see it as much in some of the other ones because a lot of the seams and everything blend together. So just the way I chose to do the colors on this, I think makes it stand out a lot more. So it is a beautiful, beautiful pattern. It's a nice big quilt. So it finishes at 69 inches by 75 3/4. So it's a really big quilt. You could always just do, less blocks and make it smaller if that's what you need. But I'm really happy with how it looks finished. It was just a really, really big struggle, but I'm glad that I just, powered through and finished the top. I'm excited to see what it looks like quilted, because sometimes that always changes everything too, the way you choose to quilt it and bring everything together. So I need to think on that and think of how I want to quilt it, if I want to try and send it off and get a nice machine design on it, or if I just want to follow the seams and do some blocks like I normally do with quilting on my just domestic machine. But let me know your thoughts. What color thread should I use? Have you tried making this quilt before? Did you run into any of the similar struggles that I had? I'd like to hear from you guys. So yeah, that was my most difficult quilt pattern to power through. Let me know if you have a quilt pattern that you found really, really hard to do. I'd love to hear about that. I love chatting with you guys in the comments. So until next time, thanks for watching. Bye.